So here we are, week 3 of Bible month. And I'm going to begin with a brief reminder of where we've got to so far. I'm not sure if you are like me, watching serials on television. I absolutely have to have the catch-up bit beforehand so that I remember what's happening. So let's find out what's been happening in Mark so far. A long time ago now, I heard a series of radio programs. They were on separate days, Monday to Friday, and each one gave a short account of a party that somebody had been at. And as the week went on, you realised they'd been at the same party, but you were getting different accounts. So, although there was plenty of overlap, they'd obviously been in the same place, there were also quite distinct differences, and each person had their own agenda. And I think it's a bit like that with the Gospels. We've got 4 accounts, but it's of the same thing, the life and teaching and death of Jesus. And yet each Gospel has its own distinctive take. So what have we learned so far about Mark's distinctive take? Well, we saw in the first week how Mark set out his agenda very plainly from the beginning. It's the good news about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Mark's focus is the person of Jesus himself, who he is and why that matters. And he sees him as the fulfillment of all God's promises to his people. And during the first 8 chapters, we've seen that being worked out in the public ministry of Jesus, particularly his teaching and his healing. And Tom showed us how these demonstrated Jesus' authority, so that people were constantly amazed by what they saw and heard. Well, this week we're going to move on to the next stage of Mark's account, another great chunk, Mark 8:22 through to chapter 10, verse 52. But as we read these chapters, we see that Mark has somehow changed gear. He's no longer focusing on Jesus' itinerant ministry. Instead, we're on a journey as Jesus travels from Caesarea Philippi, right in the very north of Galilee, all the way down to Jerusalem in the south, and going via Jericho. And it's a journey that's going to take us further in our understanding of who Jesus is and how he will fulfill God's plan of salvation. We've already seen that the ministry of Jesus was not just about what he said or did. It was also about the effect on the people who saw and heard him, what they made of it, and how they responded. And Mark has shown us that their responses are never neutral. People either accepted Jesus' authority and they responded to him in faith, or they rejected him. They refused to believe. And we get a really good example of this when Jesus healed Legion. Do you remember the man who was possessed by many evil spirits? And after he's been healed, he wants more than anything to go with Jesus. But by contrast, his neighbours, who've also witnessed the miracle, they just can't cope with Jesus' power, and they ask him to leave. This story of Legion and the others like it in the chapters we've read up to this point are rather like snapshots. They capture one particular event, and then they move on rapidly, immediately, as Mark would say, to something else. But there's one group of people we follow continuously, and that's the 12. The 12 disciples who are with Jesus all the time. And they're now going to accompany him on that long journey to Jerusalem. And because they're a constant part of the story, we get a much more complex picture of how they respond to Jesus. We're now going to have the first reading from Mark chapter 8, which John will read for us.
Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." But he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him.
So here's the crunch question. Jesus has asked the question that's central to this gospel: who do you say that I am? So many people up to this point have seen Jesus as a prophet, someone who's pointing forward to someone else. But as Jesus asks the question, his disciples suddenly see that he's actually something more. He's more than a signpost. He's the real thing to which the signposts have been pointing. And Peter, has to be Peter, hasn't it? Peter blurts out, "You're the Messiah." At last, they've got it. We can all relax. Or have they? Let's see what happens next.
Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. But Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it."
We find ourselves, don't we, saying, what's going on? How is it that Peter has got things so spectacularly right 1 minute, only to get them so spectacularly wrong the next? The problem lies in that word, Messiah. Peter and the other disciples were looking for a Messiah in the temporal sense. They wanted a king like David had been, one who would establish God's authority and justice on earth, and who would displace the power of other earthly rulers, especially Rome. And this mindset, this expectation, was very, very deeply rooted in Jewish thinking at the time. All the disciples would have been brought up with it. And so when Jesus starts talking about rejection and suffering and death, they just can't cope. This is defeatism. This can't be allowed to go on. Jesus is losing the plot. And so Peter takes him to one side and firmly tells him so. And he earns the very harshest of rebukes. But then, patiently and firmly, Jesus begins to redefine that mindset for them. He tells them he can only fulfill his role through suffering and death. And as his followers, they must expect the same. So his kingdom is going to be very different from the one they expected. And as the journey continues, we see this pattern of getting it and then losing it again being repeated several times. We see the disciples arguing about their status within the kingdom. We saw this last week, we see them trying to exclude people with no status. And we see them absolutely flabbergasted when Jesus tells them that wealth and influence can actually be barriers to entering the kingdom. What Jesus is saying doesn't fit their expectations, so he continually has to challenge them and to reinforce his message. Now, I don't know how many of you, probably looking round, quite a lot of you, have had your eyes tested. I had mine tested about a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that kept happening was that I'd have this sort of contraption on my nose, and then one lens would be put in, removed, and another lens put in. And I was asked to keep looking at the eye chart and then to say, could I see better with one lens or with the second lens? Lots of nods, so we clearly have a shared experience here. Well, I think it's a bit like that with the disciples. 1 minute, they're looking through one lens and they can see very clearly. The next minute, it's another lens and they've lost it again. It's all blurry. So maybe it's no coincidence that Mark has framed this section of the narrative that we have for week 3 with 2 stories about blind men, because physical blindness is very often a symbol of spiritual blindness in the New Testament. The first story is about a man whose sight was restored in 2 stages. In the first stage, he can see again, but everything's out of focus. In the second stage, he sees perfectly, 20/20 vision. And that's what's happening to the disciples in their journey with Jesus. Sometimes it's all out of focus, and sometimes they can see perfectly. And we see this happening again and again, until at the end of this section, we get another story about a blind man. We know who he is this time. His name is Bartimaeus, and Joe is going to read that passage for us now.
Mark 10, 46 to 52. They came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So, throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way.
Thank you. I don't know about you, that's one of my all-time favourite stories because I just love Bartimaeus. He won't shut up. In fact, the more people try to shut him up, the louder he becomes because he's persistent. He knows exactly what he wants. He wants to see. And so ultimately do the disciples. They may keep getting things wrong, but they stick with Jesus and they continue to follow him. So what might all this be saying to us? What's it been saying to me over the past week or so as I've been thinking about what I'll say this morning? Well, first, there's a challenge. What are the lenses in my life that stop me seeing Jesus clearly? When do I make Jesus into my idea of what he should be like, rather than seeing him as he really is? If you've ever read The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, you may remember that there was a conversation about Aslan between the children and Mr. and Mrs. Beaver. Mrs. Beaver says, "If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly." And Lucy says, "Then he isn't safe." "Safe?" said Mr. Beaver. "Who said anything about safe? Course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king." I wonder if, like me, you often want Jesus to be safe. And as a result, the image becomes blurry. What about that lens of self-centeredness? Letting self-interest or self-importance or our own comfort and security or even our own convenience get in the way of seeing Jesus and his claim on our lives. That's what's happening when the disciples argue about status, or the rich young ruler can't accept Jesus' challenge to sell all he has and follow him. So there are plenty of challenges for us as we read through this section of Mark's Gospel. But the other thing this chapter says to me is that while there's challenge, there's also enormous encouragement. Blind Bartimaeus knew exactly what he wanted, and he wasn't going to give up. I want to see, and see he does. And then he follows Jesus. We need to be as persistent and to do the same. Amen.